from the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets. Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this new normal?
Are markets too optimistic?
How do you worry about the things that are outside your control?
How does the current fighting completely stop?
I'm Francine Lacroix, and this is The Pulse, every weekday at 9 a.m. only on Bloomberg.
The top names in global leadership are on Bloomberg.
Japan has made changes to 5 separate 70-year-old policies. They've gone from 1% to 2% on GDP for defense. They'll become the 3rd largest military. They've changed their export capability. They've opened up and stabilized their relationship with Korea. Japan can be a significant partner in the region.
Nobody covers the top global leaders like Bloomberg Television and Radio. Context changes everything.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons live at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Monday, it's day one with work to be had. In the next few hours, we'll see Democrats adopt a party platform and codify the nominations, already done virtually, but here in Chicago, of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. Kaylee, it'll all come together later this evening with an address by President Biden, as we hear so much about passing the baton. This is actually it today.
Yeah, it will be a physical manifestation of that. He, of course, will be speaking after his wife, First Lady Jill Biden, in what is surely going to be emotional, as it was just over 4 weeks ago that the president made the decision to not seek re-election and instead to endorse Kamala Harris, who was getting ready to formally accept the nomination this week. It's a question of looking back at the past 3.5 years while looking forward to the next 4 that Kamala Harris would like to promise to the American people should she win in November.
That'll be the trajectory of the week here. Former President Barack Obama tomorrow night, Tim Walz Wednesday, and of course Kamala Harris in her acceptance speech on Thursday. We're going to be talking a lot about issues, many of which are mentioned in the party platform. We're also going to be talking about the massive protests that are expected. We saw some smaller protest marches last night, Kaylee, but there are tens of thousands of people who have made their way to Chicago because of one issue. That's Israel. And it's one that we're actually hearing some headlines on today.
Yeah, the breaking news just crossing the Bloomberg terminal from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who says Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have accepted a U.S.-backed bridge ceasefire proposal. They're calling on Hamas to do the same. Of course, it is not official until Hamas does so, but this could be an incredibly important moment for the incumbent president and for the presidential candidate herself, Kamala Harris. This is an issue that has been quite politically disruptive, I would say, within the Democratic Party. And joining us now is someone who is within the Democratic Party and also is in his home state of Illinois. Congressman Sean Casten is here with us in our studios in Chicago. Congressman, it's great to see you, sir.
Thank you.
Obviously, this is just breaking as we speak, but I do wonder what your reaction is to this news that maybe a ceasefire is one step closer as we await word from Hamas.
You know, I think we're hopeful. I represent one of the largest Palestinian diasporas in the country, and you know we've had personal constituent stories where we've had to help get people out of Gaza, get people out of the West Bank, try to get people with their land freed up. I've also spent quite a bit of time traveling in the region and meeting with hostage families, and that there is a deal to be had. There's a deal that's been habitable for a long time with absolutely getting the hostages back, absolutely preserving our relationship with Israel, absolutely providing dignity and hope, and hopefully ultimately a path to a Palestinian state. You know, unfortunately, some of the right-wing elements of the Israeli government and Hamas have been the biggest obstacles to that deal. So I'm encouraged to hear that maybe we have something, but we'll have to see what Hamas does next.
If this news is made official, if Hamas does accept this deal in the middle of the Democratic National Convention, what does that do to the issue? What does that do to the uncommitted delegates or the protesters outside the room? You're the perfect person to answer that, as you are specifically representing many constituents who are upset about this.
Well, given how long this conflict has persisted, I think if we try to solve it to address short-term U.S. political issues, we're probably not thinking about it the right way. You know, if this has been a long time coming, it was not helped in the prior administration when you know we had the Abraham Accords, which created some peace, but stapled to the Abraham Accords was this idea that it was okay for the Netanyahu government to sort of slice and dice the West Bank into this, you know, into something that gave no continuous property. And politically, of course, it would be wonderful to have a solution right now, but I think it's much more important that we have a long-term solution that we can look back on 5-10 years from now and say, this was a turning point, not just this was something that was politically well-timed.
Sure. And of course, there is a massive humanitarian aspect here that we have to consider. Obviously, this is an issue you're passionate about given your constituency, Congressman, but we know there's other issues that you're passionate about and focus on in your work in Congress as well. One of them being climate. Taking a look at the policy platform the party's getting set to adopt today, Chapter 4 is tackling the climate crisis and along with that, lowering energy costs. Obviously, Joe Biden has tried to be a climate president, certainly in the Inflation Reduction Act. He has had some legislative accomplishments in that regard. What do you expect Kamala Harris can do to advance that agenda moving forward, realistically knowing she might not necessarily have both chambers of Congress to work with here?
Well, number one, we have to give tremendous credit to Joe Biden. This was the single biggest climate bill ever passed by any government in the history of the world. And that came from my friend and my colleague, Kathy Castor, on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. We came up with a list of about 700 proposals, of which 300 of them are now law through the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are not only good bills for climate, they're good bills for energy. If you can heat your house without buying natural gas, you don't have to pay for natural gas. If you can drive your car without buying gasoline, you don't have to pay for gasoline. If you can power your house without buying electricity, you don't have to pay for electricity. Clean energy is cheap energy. And what's happened as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act has been a huge investment in America, huge amounts of capital that have come to build battery factories, electric vehicle charging. The challenges now, which are really good challenges, is we're creating jobs faster than skilled workers. We need to build the ecosystem to do that. We're building power plants where we have really cheap resources like sun, like wind. That's not necessarily where the wires are. And so how do we make it easier to build the transmission system, to build that up to load? We've got huge industries and factories and homes that are electrifying. They also need more power. So this is a huge investment opportunity. And I think the challenge that the Harris team understands is this is really a shift in our energy policy, from an energy policy that focuses on the interests of energy producers to an energy policy that focuses on the interest of energy consumers. And just to highlight that point, April 2020, Donald Trump got on the phone, called the Saudis, and said, I'm taking the troops out of Saudi Arabia unless you cut production to increase oil prices because our oil producers are struggling with cheap oil prices. Understand who the Republican agenda is fighting for. They're fighting to raise energy prices for energy producers, and the Harris agenda is to fight to lower prices for consumers.
Well, interesting, because we're pumping a record amount of gas and oil right now. Donald Trump says drill, baby, drill is his answer to the inflation that we're experiencing here. Increased production, lower energy costs, everything else follows. He's also promising to roll back, essentially to do away with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, if he's elected. Do you take him at his word?
Donald Trump also says that electric vehicles could cause you to get attacked by a shark. I don't really know that his energy policy has a lot of.
I think Elon Musk turned him around on that last one. I'm not sure. But I mean, could Congress protect the IRA if Donald Trump's in the White House?
What we did very intentionally in the IRA is the IRA is long on carrots and short on sticks. There are a lot of communities in rural America, urban America, red America, blue America that are benefiting from access to capital. Once you have a solar panel on your roof, there is no scenario where you say the price of electricity is too low today for me to justify operating my solar panel, right? On the other hand, if you've got a gas turbine, there are times when you say, boy, the price of gas is too high for me to justify operating the gas turbine. So that capital deployment is going to be very hard to undo. I do think it's important on this sort of drill, baby, drill is like run the math. U.S. coal consumption has collapsed in the last decade. U.S. oil consumption is flat over the last decade. Gas consumption is up, but it's decoupled from GDP growth. Our economy is decarbonizing. The only future for the oil, gas, and coal industry, production industry in the U.S. is for exports. And so we're seeing this surge in exports in the United States and indeed a surge in production. But I think the question we have is like, if we as Americans know that we have access to cheaper and cleaner energy, are we going to make a commitment to exporting the technologies that we've manufactured in the United States with U.S. expertise so that other countries can benefit from our knowledge? Or are we going to export the more expensive, dirty energy sources that we've decided can't compete in our economy? Like, that's the practical reality. And again, there is a difference there between the two candidates. But you're right that the U.S. is producing records amounts of oil and gas right now, but it's increasingly for export.
Well, but Donald Trump does see it as a way in which to fight inflation. So it becomes, if it's not drill, baby, drill for the Democratic Party or for Vice President Harris, the actual efforts that she would have to fight inflation. Some of the economic policies she rolled out last week, and I'm asking you as a member of the Financial Services Committee, you get to question Chairman Powell and Treasury Secretary Yellen frequently. We think about some policies as being inflationary, including, for example, subsidizing homeownership or anything that could create a larger deficit that you can't necessarily pay for. All of this could have inflationary effects, could it not? How do you really look at the platform she rolled out last week?
Well, look at what happened since 2020. The United States, there was a global surge in inflation. The United States, because of the actions that we took in the American Rescue Plan, saw inflation rise slower than other OECD countries and come down faster, right? And the big difference, and this was very intentional, was, particularly compared to 2008, was to try to make sure that we were getting resources to people regardless of whether or not they had existing banking relationships, right? And so, yes, we saw inflation in the United States, but we saw wage inflation generally higher than goods inflation in the U.S. Didn't happen in other countries, right? So we've seen a closing of the wealth gap, particularly with lower quartiles. Black and brown communities have historically been left behind. And that structure of saying, let's make it easier for folks to buy homes, let's make it easier for people to buy things like solar panels that maybe they don't have the capital for it, but once they have it, now they have cheaper energy, right? And to push from there, and just to come back on the export again, we have massive amounts of oil and gas in the United States. If we want to keep oil and gas costs low in the United States, we should maximize the supply in the United States, because high supply leads to low prices, right? When we export, we actually raise the price. And you've seen there's the Freeport LNG terminal down in Texas had an outage a couple of years ago. When it went out, immediately the price of gas, natural gas in the United States, went down, because all of a sudden we couldn't export as much, and there was a surge in the United States. Again, what is in our interest? Is it in our interest to lower costs for American consumers, or in our interest to raise prices so the U.S. exporters can make more money? That's an inflation strategy, right? The other thing that I just say on inflation is one of the real blessings that's helped keep inflation low has been because the United States is a country that people want to come to. We've seen a surge in net immigration into the United States, which has kept wage pressure down. And of course, we want secure borders, but I think it's important to understand that an intelligent immigration policy is one of the tools that we have to keep inflation down. And if we just look at what Donald Trump's saying, I'm going to clamp down on inflation, I'm going to increase tariffs, that's a massively inflationary policy.
We have less than a minute left, Congressman. Will it be incumbent upon Kamala Harris then to explain to the American people, with your financial services hat on, why her plans are not inflationary?
I think I trust the American people to understand that. I trust the American people to understand. I mean, one of the things that I like to do, I did a town hall a while ago, and somebody said, "What are you doing to lower inflation?" And I said, "Did you get a raise last year?" And the guy said, "I did." I said, "Was it a good raise?" He said, "Yeah, it was pretty good." And I said, "Well, number one, you're welcome. Number two, does it bother you that was inflationary?"
It's funny how that works.
What matters is that people have more money in their pocket after they've bought all of the groceries and everything else. Exactly. And I think we've seen a really strong and growing record growth in the U.S. economy, record low unemployment. We're going to keep it up.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
In Chicago. Have a great convention.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
On Bloomberg TV and radio. Illinois Congressman Sean Casten with us here on Balance of Power. We've got a lot more ahead from Chicago, but we want to keep tabs on the markets too. And for that, we turn to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle in New York. How's it going, Abigail?
Well, Joe, it's interesting. We're looking at a classic summer melt up here. We now have the S&P 500 up for an 8th day in a row. That's the longest winning streak going back to November of 2023. The NASDAQ 100 is also higher, heading to a 5th up day. And the Russell 2000 500,000 are those small cap stocks, those more domestically based stocks during this DNC week, outperforming a little bit, up 0.8%, up for a third day in a row. Now, beneath the surface, though, volume is pretty anemic for that S&P 500, 30% below the recent average. So investors not all that committed to these gains, which is sort of interesting. And of course, we did have that big sell-off into the last 8 days, down about 10%, now up about 7%. So still at a deficit from the recent highs. Now, influencing trade today, some retail earnings will trickle in this week. They actually did already, Estee Lauder, and then importantly Target. But I would say this week is much more about the macro, because of course we do have the DNC and election 2024, that focus. We also have the yen. There's been so much news about the yen carry trade unwind. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago when stocks were selling off so brutally, that had everything to do with the Haven yen rallying, which pushes the dollar yen lower. When the yen is lower, the actual yen, it provides cheap money for people to borrow that and then put it into any other risk asset. One of the reasons that we may have had such a big rally, robust rally for stocks so far this year. Now, earlier today, that yen had rallied by more than 1%. At that point, stocks about flat. But now that it's off,
more money in their pocket after they've bought all of the groceries and everything else. Exactly. And
in expectation with the Fed. And speaking of the Fed, Jackson Hole later this week will be listening to Fed Chair Jerome Powell's key, one of the highlights for market watchers every year. I think it's largely expected that he's going to toe the line in terms of cuts ahead. But of course, we are at DNC election 2024. If we go into the Bloomberg terminal and take a look at where predicted is relative to the betting odds, well, it is wider, but it's also narrower. So at the widest between Kamala Harris, VP Harris, and Donald Trump, it was something like 12 to 13%. Now it's 10% in favor of Kamala Harris, with Donald Trump trailing, which is, of course, a big reversal of what had been the case with Joe Biden. And on the day, we do have the shares of some of the Harris trade stocks, such as grocers, trading lower, and the prospect of stabilized grocery prices, home builders higher, and DJT itself is down. So overall, Kaylee, I would say it's not a bad day for the quote unquote Harris trade. This as the DNC, of course, kicks off.
All right, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle in New York. Thank you so much. Keeping an eye on the political and market implications of politics, we always appreciate, but of course giving us a good reminder that this convention is not happening in a vacuum. It comes at the same week as Jackson Hole, where we'll hear from Chairman Powell at the end of the week about interest rates and the trajectory of them, which could have implications for this election. It also comes with ceasefire talks making progress in the Middle East. The headline crossing this hour from the Bloomberg terminal, Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying that Israel has accepted a ceasefire agreement, and now we wait for Hamas.
In a very constructive meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu today, he confirmed to me that Israel accepts the bridging proposal, that he supports it. It's now incumbent on Hamas to do the same. And then the parties, with the help of the mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, have to come together and complete the process of reaching clear understandings about how they'll implement the commitments that they've made.
So let's bring back now our political panel here in Chicago. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So incredible to get this news as we're sitting here in Chicago waiting for President Biden to speak this evening, knowing that he has said a ceasefire agreement is one of the things he wants to make sure he accomplishes before leaving office. Obviously, there are massive humanitarian implications here for the people living in Gaza, for the families of the hostages, for the hostages themselves, Jeannie, that cannot go unsaid. But politically, this is significant as well.
This is. And I think, we can be cautiously optimistic about what Antony Blinken has said. But of course, I think we have to be cautious because at the same time, Hamas has said it's dissatisfied with what it describes as some of Israel's demands in this. And so I think we do, to your point, have to wait and see. If this comes to fruition, the timing is critically important for all of the reasons you mentioned, which are the most important, but also politically, because if it came together today, before President Biden speaks, that would be enormously important for his legacy, which he is attached to this in a profound way. And of course, issues involving the Middle East have had an enormously negative impact on presidents going back several decades in the U.S. So for him to be thinking about leaving office in January and to have a win like this, if it happens, would be enormously important.
Well, caution is the important word, I think, in your setup there, Jeannie, because we've seen this before. Joe Biden made an address to the nation from the White House about this plan back around Memorial Day, and it was not signed off on at the time, apparently, by the Netanyahu government, and Hamas went back and forth for weeks on this, ended with nothing. We just asked Sean Casten, who made clear that his constituents represent one of the largest blocks of pro-Palestinian voters in the country. He was very careful when we asked him about this. He didn't want to see this move in too quickly this week, a long-term deal, he said. How careful should Democrats be right now with such a hot issue around this convention?
Yeah, I think you have to be very careful. I'm pessimistic that if your peace is reliant upon Hamas, you're going to have to wait. Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire. They don't want a situational one. Mm-hmm. And for that reason alone, they will probably reject this offer. They've rejected previous offers that were similar in nature to this one. As you say, they've been talking about this for a long time. I don't think there's any reason to believe that Hamas is going to see this as anything different.
Is it smart politically to do this in public then, to goad them to it?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's good to have government transparency, right? Yeah. I mean, like, this is an important issue, as Jeannie says. To a lot of people, it's not just politics. And I think it's good that this is being aired out. We don't normally get to see sausage being made in these kinds of negotiations. But I think it's too soon to tell whether or not Hamas is prepared to come to the table and actually be a part of a community that wants to see peace. It's not been their history. And they've been very clear that they want a permanent ceasefire. They just don't want to pay for it. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's also worth noting Hamas operates as a proxy of Iran. We are still awaiting Iranian retaliation against Israel for the assassination of leaders of Hezbollah and of course, Hamas in Tehran earlier this summer. So that maybe is a complicating factor in all of this as well. But it was described to us by our political editor, Laura Davison, earlier this hour, Jeannie, as really something that actually can create some separation between President Biden, who is president and therefore is the one that really has to deal with this, and Kamala Harris, who can speak about it, who can try to frame it to her benefit, but doesn't necessarily have that commander-in-chief title at this time where this is incumbent upon her to deal with. So to what extent, regardless of whether or not Hamas accepts or the negotiations are still ongoing, should Harris be talking about this issue or others, like economy and the border, at the convention this week?
You know, I think the convention, we're not going to hear a lot of policy specifics. I think we're going to hear an introduction of Kamala Harris because a lot of people are not intimately familiar with her, even though she's been in our lives as vice president for almost 4 years now. So that's going to be what she does this week. We will hear more about policy going forward. But to your point, I don't think we're going to hear a lot on the specifics of something like this. And so, you know, she is going to try to get some of that separation from President Biden on things that he is not particularly popular on and try to embrace those things he is. So if there was a win on this, that would be enormously helpful. But most importantly, for the families of the hostages and, you know, all the people affected by this, regardless of the politics of this thing.
Well, you know, if you're running a convention, though, and you've got 30 uncommitted delegates on the floor, is this an opportunity? There may not be a deal here, but this week in Chicago, there might be a sit-down conversation between the Harris campaign and those delegates to say, look, we're trying to move the ball.
Right. I think anything you can do to sort of inoculate the convention to delegates who aren't looking at the same success you are is important. You're going to do that anyway.
You wouldn't just ignore it.
They've been doing it. You wouldn't just ignore it. Maybe their bus breaks down on the way to the convention on Thursday night, but that's another thing. But the reality is...
and of course, Hamas in Tehran earlier this summer. So that maybe is a complicating factor.
For Biden to be able to talk about this tonight. Now, with Israel signing on, maybe that's enough for him. But to get a ceasefire the night of your, last speech to the convention as president, it would be a really special moment for him. And suffice it to say, I doubt if Hamas is really caring whether or not Joe Biden has a good night or not.
Well, fair enough. But it will be a night for Joe Biden, the only one, frankly, he's going to get at this convention. Jeannie, we've talked at length about how difficult this moment may be emotionally, given his long career in public service, but he has made the decision to pass the baton and will do so in a very real way. This evening, we're also going to be hearing from members of his family. Jill Biden is speaking tonight. Ashley Biden is introducing him, according to the speaker's list. What tone do you expect to hear, not just from the president, but from those closest to him?
I think we're going to hear the closeness of their relationship with their husband, their father. This is a family who has gone through so much trauma, especially in the last few years. And so I think we're going to hear a lot of love and respect from them. And I think they're going to be celebrating his work. I mean, 1972, he enters Congress at 29, and he departs today, the convention, or tonight, the convention, and in a few months, the presidency. So it's a big, big moment for him. But I think most important, they're all going to agree, we want Kamala Harris to succeed and beat Donald Trump.
So prepare for a lot of young photos of Joe Biden with dark hair is what you're saying.
That's right.
Great conversation with our signature panel, as always. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano are going to be with us for the week here in Chicago, with a lot more to follow as the DNC gets underway. We are expecting to get more details about Vice President Harris's policy platform. In fact, we heard a preview last week when it came to the economy specifically, and housing even more so. For more on that issue, we bring in Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who's just outside the Convention Hall, the United Center here in Chicago. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Housing affordability and availability are becoming top issues on the campaign trail. As you mentioned, Vice President Kamala Harris started to unveil some of her economic policies last week. While we're still waiting for more details, she did make housing a key part of her policy proposal. I want you to take a listen here to what she told voters on Friday when it came to housing and how she's messaging around the issue.
I know how to fight for people who are being exploited in the housing market. And I know what home ownership means. It's more than a financial transaction. It's so much more than that. It's more than a house.
Harris's plan calls for the construction of 3 million new housing units over 4 years, as well as a tax incentive for building starter homes. Harris has also pledged $25,000 in down payment assistance for some first-time homebuyers, and the campaign is also urging Congress to pass an act that would curtail major investors from buying single-family homes in bulk for development. Now, Fed Chair Jerome Powell has said that tighter monetary policy is impacting the housing market, and we'll have to wait to see how any expected rate cuts in September could unlock the market in any way. But Joe and Kaylee, Powell also often points out that the Fed can't control a shortage of affordable housing units in the parts of the market that need it the most.
Yep, can hit demand but not supply. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall reporting outside the United Center. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm pleased to bring in now with us here in Chicago someone with a unique perspective on real estate and rates in general. The CEO of Chicago developer Sterling Bay, Andy Glore, is here on set with Joe and I. Welcome to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Andy, it's great to have you. I would like to start, as we are here for the Democratic Convention. It is DNC week. It's also Jackson Hole week, which our audience is perhaps just as equally, if not more, enthused about. Obviously, the real estate industry has felt high interest rates in a very real way. What kind of cuts are you expecting, and what happens for your business, for your industry when they come?
Well, I will say this. I mean, I think the commercial real estate business has been under a Category 5 storm for a few years now, to say the least. And if you look at the real estate business, you can only control so many things: your cost of capital, your cost to build the building, and then how much people will pay. And unfortunately, two of those things have been in all-time highs for the last 25 years. And so I was hoping in June something might have happened, but we're hoping for at least 50 basis points in September and hopefully another 50 basis points. And I think that will be a green shoot that everyone's looking for, that will slowly start allowing the capital that's been sitting on the sidelines to start investing.
You got to love coming on Bloomberg. Kaylee Lyons hits you with the Fed on the first.
We got a lot more to say there,
Well, I bet that's true. Talk to us about Chicago, though. What would that mean for record vacancy rates in this city that have been so sticky?
Yeah, I think if you look at Chicago, it's not dissimilar to other major urban areas. Is that you have concentration of office, you have office that is B and C type product, and so I think you need to lower the cost of capital for people to start making investments back into these urban areas. And let's face it. we need to get these cities back on track. We need to get people coming back to work. And I think that you need to change some of the fundamentals, as I said, with interest rates to make that a reality.
Is the money there, though? Is the interest there? Everyone's waiting for the bottom, waiting for the moment?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say we're in the trough.
Yeah.
And I think people are just looking for a green shoot. They want to see the Fed make a move. And I think most people think the Fed was too slow in curbing inflation up front. I think that's widely accepted. I just hope they're not too slow on lowering rates going forward.
Okay, so if we're in the trough, does that make this the prime opportunity for a bargain?
Yes.
Then are you running out of time to pick up on some of those opportunities?
Real estate doesn't move that quickly, but what I would say over the next 2 quarters, I don't think there is a better time in commercial real estate to acquire because of the dislocation. So I think you're right. I think the opportunities that we're seeing, we haven't seen in 20 years. And so I think it is a great time. And now it's a contrarian move. You have to have the capital there, but I do think there's a lot of institutional capital sitting on the sidelines waiting for the Fed to make a move.
We've heard a bit from Donald Trump about the city of Chicago. Just most recently, about a week ago, compared it to Afghanistan, referring to crime stats here. Let's go back to 2019, as this is not a new refrain for the former president. Here's Donald Trump.
It's embarrassing to us as a nation. All over the world, they're talking about Chicago. Afghanistan is a safe place by comparison. It's true.
Saying the same thing now 5 years later. What does Donald Trump not understand about Chicago?
I think at the time, during the pandemic, Chicago, like other urban areas, it was a terrible time, and crime skyrocketed. I think if you look at the statistics now, we're going in the right direction.
Not just pointing to the 4th of July just last week, said 117 shootings took place here, more than happened in Afghanistan.
I'll say this, it's a number one priority for the city. It needs to remain a number one priority. No one is happy with where we're at right now. It needs to improve, but we are taking steps in the right direction, whether that takes another year or two or longer. I just want to make sure that no matter what happens over the next few years, it has to remain a top priority. If people don't feel safe here, they're not going to relocate their businesses here. They're not going to live here. So that has to remain a top priority.
Well, and of course, the city's not a monolith. You've invested in specific areas. You were a key part in building out Fulton Market. Where are you looking at new opportunities? As we talk about picking up these bargains and spending capital, where within Chicago do you invest?
I mean, I think if you look at the demographics, we obviously have substantial holdings here in Chicago, but we're in a dozen markets around the country. We're in Charlotte, we're in Atlanta, we're in Durham, we're in Miami, we're in Austin. So we are definitely diversified geographically, and we're also diversified from a product standpoint. So we started off doing primarily office, and now we do office, industrial, life science, and residential. So,
with our eyes on the housing market for a moment, we're just hearing about Kamala Harris's platform. She's offering, or wants to offer, $25,000 in down payment assistance to more than 1 million first-time home buyers. What would that do to the market? What would that do to prices?
Well, I would say this. There's a national housing shortage, both for workforce housing and just housing in general. And so we have to find a way to jumpstart that segment. And one of those ways is lowering rates. And one of those ways potentially could be government incentives to expedite that process. But it's definitely an issue, not just in Chicago, but around the country as well.
Well, you clearly have some thoughts for Chairman Powell, and others have as well. I mean, Donald Trump has suggested that he would like to play a role in monetary policy decision-making if he wins. Kamala Harris, for her part, seems to be more on the Fed is independent train. But it does speak to this idea that the outcome of this election could have an impact here as well. So knowing the lens with which you are viewing it, what is your view on what happens in November?
I would say as long as there's open communication and collaboration, it's not unlike what's happening with the Supreme Court. But whether that should be a term for life, I'm not the guy to answer that. But I do think there needs to be some input from the government and the Fed.
You do?
Yeah, I do. I do. What that looks like, what autonomy they maintain. As I said, it's not my expertise, but I do think, based on how I think too slow they were to cut rates, and hopefully they're going to, lower rates. Too slow to raise rates, and hopefully they're too aggressive to cut rates would be better. So I don't have the answer to that. They need to maintain their autonomy. At the same token, I think a little more communication, a little more collaboration would be better.
Donald Trump told Bloomberg Business Week that he'd like to keep Jay Powell on, which surprised a lot of people. It didn't seem like a real big fan. You think that's a good idea? if he's reelected?
That's out of my lane.
I finally found the
That's
sweet
way
spot.
out of my lane. Okay, I don't know. Not to say we don't think rates should have gone down earlier.
Yeah,
but that's I don't know.
You'll take the Fed share you get, it sounds like.
Exactly.
Many thanks to Sterling Bay CEO Andy Glure. What a fascinating look at the city that we're all getting to know all over again here. Kaylee, thanks for being with us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate your time, sir. And of course, Andy, here with us. We are just guests in the city this week, along with tens of thousands of other people who are here in town for the Democratic National Convention.
50,000 for the convention. I think you can add quite a bit more when you consider the protesters who are in town here, Kaylee. We're going to see how this goes. We'll spend some time between now and the late edition of Balance of Power, check things out on the streets of Chicago, and let you know a little bit later on as we work our way up to Joe Biden's speech tonight. It does it from the Democratic National Convention for now. As I mentioned, we'll be back 5 p.m. Eastern. For Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.